she's also, towards the end of the presentation, going to talk about the last parcel of publicly accessible land on DeKalb Avenue. And provided that traffic does not interfere, we will have a musical guest at the end of the program. Heidi Collier will perform a couple of traditional songs that were done on the Gordon estate. And there will be an opportunity for audience participation. So welcome again. We really thank you all for being here. Teri?
Well, howdy. This is a great group here. I'm so glad you all could come. I'm going to hang around a little bit afterwards in case anybody has questions. But basically, I came to Atlanta about 40 years ago as a wild, crazy hippie chick from Austin, Texas, and became a wild, crazy hippie chick here in Atlanta. And that's when I discovered the Gordon estate. I love to explore. I love history. I noticed on DeKalb Avenue there were these mysterious stone stairs that went up, and when I followed them up, you could see the remains of an old circular drive, the foundation of a large house, and the back where the well used to be, and I became fascinated by this particular piece of property. Ironically, 33 years ago, I ended up moving to Gordon Avenue, which is actually part of the same original parcel. Before I get totally into this, I want to make a big thank you for the organizations that have made my exploration into the Gordon family possible. That's the Atlanta History Center, the DeKalb History Center, and of course their lovely space, and most importantly, the Rare Book Archives at the Hargret Library at the University of Georgia in Athens, where I was able to spend several days doing research on the Gordon family. And much to my amazement, not only was there a huge comprehensive series of files on the white Gordons, but there was also a huge companion file on the black Gordons. And that's when I discovered that the Gordons were in fact a biracial family. Interestingly enough, in 1974, the DeKalb Heritage Trust said that the remains of the Gordon estate should be preserved as a public park because of its great historical importance. So I'm going to backtrack. This is going to be sort of a non-linear history thing here. So I'm going to backtrack to the beginning. There was a huge estate acquired by Kirkpatrick, for which Kirkwood is named, in the early 1800s during the Georgia land lottery. And at that time, the property had been owned by the Creek Indians, and they were driven off their land, and the property was given to white settlers. Kirkpatrick got a huge parcel of land that includes what is today Kirkwood, Candler Park, Lake Claire, across Ponce, and Kirkpatrick died right before the Civil War, and his estate was subdivided between his sons and his wife. His wife got the most valuable piece of property because it actually had mineral springs on the property. And I assume that's probably on the other side of what is now Ponce de Leon. Interestingly enough, it would be great to be able to follow some of these old plats and deeds, because I'm sure that somebody has a big wet spot in their backyard, or a porch, you know, that's always rotten, or a basement that's always leaking, and that's probably where the mineral springs were. After the Civil War, the land was subdivided again by Kirkpatrick's sons, and the Gordons acquired 86.5 acres. They named it Sutherland, which was Fanny Gordon, who was the wife of John Gordon, was her mother's maiden name. And what's sort of interesting is when you look at the names of the families that were there, almost all of them originated in northern Scotland. Kirkpatrick means...
Just 1 second. Folks are having a hard time.
I'm not used to this fancy technology here. Kirkpatrick is an old Scottish word meaning the church to St. Patrick. Sutherland and Fanny's maiden name, which are Harrelson, are old Scottish names which actually date back to the Vikings. Sutherland means in Old Danish, the South Land, which is what northern Scotland was to the Danes. Haraldson is also an old Viking name meaning son of Harald. Gordon, interestingly enough, is in the same part of northern Scotland. So I think if we went back far enough into history, we would actually find old connections between these particular families, which somehow ended up in Candler Park, Lake Claire, and Kirkwood. Now everybody is pretty much familiar with Major General John B. Gordon. Next slide. He's the guy on the horse outside the state capitol, and he was a senator and twice governor of Georgia. He was a Civil War hero and served under General Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was grievously wounded, seriously wounded at the Battle of Bloody Lane, where he was shot multiple times and fell off his horse and actually landed with his face down in his hat. And he said he would have drowned in his own blood, except that fortunately a Yankee had put another bullet hole through his hat. He surrendered with Lee at Appomattox. And if you've ever seen the Ken Burns film series on the Civil War, there's a wonderful piece, regardless of what you think of the Civil War 160 years later, a wonderful piece about when Gordon surrendered with Lee. Apparently he came up on his horse, and when they came up to the point of surrender, he saluted with his sword, his horse bowed, and he dipped his sword to the ground as a gesture of surrender. He died in 1904, and there was a huge funeral downtown that went on for many, many days. He and Fanny were married for many years. They had a long and loving relationship, and Fanny and John are buried side by side in Oakland Cemetery next to the old Confederate section. Can you hear me over the music okay? Fanny Gordon, next slide. Fanny Gordon was a Spitfire, whereas the general was known as sort of a howdy-do kind of nice guy. Fanny Gordon was the one with the brains and the determination, and obviously a much better business person than John was. She outlived him by 27 years. She was the daughter of General Haraldson and related by blood to George Washington's sister Betty and Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition. She and John met in 1854, and it was love at first sight. She was 17, he was 22 when they got married. And they got married in 1854. She actually accompanied him all 4 years to the front during the Civil War, fought side by side, nursed the soldiers back to health. And in fact, General Early said that he wished the Yankees would capture Ms. Gordon and keep her till the end of the war so she'd stay away from the front. He also later apologized and said that if his troops kept up as well as Ms. Gordon did, he'd never again have to issue another order against stragglers. At the Battle of Winchester, which this is an illustration from, when the shells were exploding and the troops were retreating, Fanny Gordon was the person who seized the flag, rallied the troops, and personally led them back into battle again. When they bought the Sutherland estate in 1871, they were chronically in debt. John was not a good businessman, although he was apparently a pretty nice guy. And what would happen is they would live lavishly way beyond their lifestyle. So creditors were constantly coming to seize the Gordon estate Sutherland. To prevent the estate from being seized, John and Fanny would pass it back and forth to each other for $5, love, and affection. John, of course, died in 1904, and in 1906, creditors seized the Gordon estate for for monies owed. Fanny Gordon, right here at the Decatur Courthouse, at the back entrance, which used to be the front entrance because of the railroad and because DeKalb Avenue used to be the old Decatur Wagon Road, actually saved Sutherland from the creditors by personally raising $8,700 and thus was able to save the Gordon estate. She started the Sutherland Realty Company in 1911 and started the neighborhood of Lake Claire, which she did by selling off parcels of land. And Gordon Avenue, where I live, is one of the streets that was created by Fanny Gordon. That same year, 1911, for the price of $1, she gave Southern Bell permission to install the first telephone lines. She died in 1931, and in 1942, the Gordon estate was in disrepair and was demolished. At that same time, in the Atlanta Constitution, they recorded this as a very great loss to history, and a poem was included which went, "They are tearing down the walls today of a Georgia mansion old and gray. It was Gordon's home, and once again we hear the tramp of his marching men." Caroline? The very talented Caroline Lewis Gordon. She wrote an autobiography called "The General and Ms. Fanny," which are her memoirs of growing up at the Gordon estate in the 1880s. She actually divided her autobiography into two parts. The first is called The Book of Stories, which are actual stories from the period. The second is the Book of Songs. And these are actual songs that were sung on the Gordon estate after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. She performed on stage and traveled, reading excerpts from her diary and performing the music until she got engaged and her husband, her future husband, decided this was not, this was a little too risque for his future wife. So he prevented her from doing future performances. And when you read the autobiography is absolutely fascinating. Not all of it would be what we consider politically correct today, but I think the thing that comes across the most is the loving long-term relationship between the black and white Gordons. The black Gordons had their own home at Sutherland. The black and white Gordon children were raised together and had a very long and loving relationship. Next. This is Sarah Gordon seated there and two of her children. Now, in 1854, before the Civil War, Sarah and Jim owned John and Fanny owned two slaves. Their names were Jim and Sarah. Now, Jim was John's manservant, as they called him, and Sarah was Fanny's personal maid. Sarah and Fanny grew up together and had an extremely close relationship. Fanny's wedding present from her father was Sarah. Now, people wonder how the black and the white Gordons sort of came to be. My personal theory, and I think this would be a great topic for the history detectives, is that Sarah and Fanny were either sisters or they were cousins, because the two women were extremely tight, had been raised together, lived together their entire lives, and stayed together for most of their lives. Interestingly enough, Sarah and Jim were married on the exact same day as John and Fanny in almost a double ceremony. After the war and after emancipation, Jim and Sarah chose to remain with John and Fanny for an additional 40 years as permanent paid companions. And again, they had their own house in Sutherland, and the white and black Gordon children were raised together. John and Fanny believed that the future of the South after the Civil War lay in education for all of its citizens. So they actually founded what were called at the time several Negro schools. All 4 of Jim and Sarah's children graduated from Morehouse College. During the Civil War, when John Gordon was seriously wounded at the Battle of Bloody Lane, he was nursed back to health by a slave by the name of Buddy Hampton. After the war, in gratitude, the Gordons, Fanny and John, sent for Buddy, and in gratitude and appreciation for him nursing General Gordon back to health, they sent him to college. Years later, Buddy Hampton came back to thank the Gordon family and said that due to his college education, he had prospered and all of his children had been able to be provided college educations as well. Into General and Ms. Fanny, after the Civil War, apparently the white and black Gordons were so poor that they would have to draw lots and rotate as to who got the next pair of shoes. So again, this shows a really, really long-term, enduring relationship between John, Fanny, Jim, and Sarah. In 1904, ironically, Jim died as well as John. And at that time, the family dispersed. The black Gordons then moved to California. And at the Hargret Rare Book Archives, there are huge files on the very, very touching and personal correspondence between the white Gordons in Georgia and the black Gordons in California, where they recalled their happy times together, their lives together at Sutherland, and growing up together. And I don't have a picture of Jim, which is too bad, but you can tell by these 2 children of Sarah's that he was obviously tall, dark, and handsome. Next picture. Walter A. Gordon. He was probably born at Sutherland in the late 1890s. In 1904, when Jim and John died and the family moved to California, Walter went with them. He was the grandson of Jim and Sarah. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate of law from the University of California. In the 1930s, he was the president of the NAACP in Berkeley. In 1943, he was sent in by Governor Earl Warren to take care of the Zoot Suit riots. And in 1955, he was appointed by President Eisenhower to be the Governor General of the Virgin Islands. So here, from one family, you had 2 governors, one white, one black,